right. We are wrapping up those people. Not the people themselves, just a series about those people this morning, which I'm not sad about. If you haven't been a part of this series, what we are talking about is when there are people in our lives who have allowed something to get a hold of them, and more than just allowed something to get a hold of them, but allowed something to get a hold of them which also impacts others. The word that we've used is the word toxic. And one more time, I want to remind you that that should not be a word that we throw around lightly, because everybody else is. That's just a word that everywhere you find, people are saying that word. It's a buzzword. And we don't want to throw that around lightly. But there are times where there are people who allow the enemy to just get certain inroads in their lives. And as a result, man, they just spread toxicity around them. And so what this series has been about is how do you love and how do you live around, and how do you know how to establish boundaries, and then how do you know when the time comes for you maybe to walk away. So this is not a type of series that you necessarily enjoy doing, but we need to talk about these things, and so it's important for us to see what does that look like biblically. I like to think that I'm a nice person. Other people may feel differently, but I like to at least think that I'm a nice person. I like being nice. I like nice people. The type of people that I want to be close are the type of people who are nice. I enjoy being nice. I enjoy other people who are nice. And so in general, I don't like to label people. I don't like to throw out words like toxic about people, right? That's not enjoyable for me. And so in many ways, I'm glad that this series is coming to an end. But also, I'm so glad that we took the time to just say, hey, how do we deal with this? Because sometimes what can happen is, as a nice person, let's say, and some of you are nice too, but for those of you who are nice, when you're a nice person, you first don't want to, there are things that can be used against you when you're a nice person. And understanding how biblically we should respond to those sorts of things is important. Because when you're a nice person, and on top of that, you read in Scripture just revolutionary things that Jesus said, which are true for us, and then you start talking about what does it look like to put limits or boundaries on people, or even, let's say, walk away from somebody, it doesn't feel right. And then you add on top of that, sometimes people will take scriptures and they will throw them in your face, and say, well, what about this? How come you're not this? And then you're like, well, wait, I'm not entirely sure that you're applying that right. And so as part of this series, even every single week, or at least for the last several weeks, what we've done is we've taken various scriptures that often will be used by people to say, here's how you should respond, which maybe isn't what it's actually saying, okay? So let me give you one today. 1 Corinthians chapter 13, verses 4 and 5. Great passage, right? All about love and what love is and what love isn't. It says there, love is patient and kind. Love is not jealous or boastful or proud or rude. It does not demand its own way. It is not irritable, and it keeps no record of being wronged. Beautiful passage. Love, though, keeps no record of being wronged. The ESV says love isn't resentful. That was the NLT, because normally what people will quote is the New Living Translation or the NIV, which says both something similar. It keeps no record of wrongs, that you need to forgive and forget, which is totally true. Jesus, well, to some degree, Jesus said things that were revolutionary about forgiveness. And these things revolutionize the way that we look at forgiving people. Absolutely revolutionary. And he showed us how to do it as well when he was on the cross. He says, Father, forgive them, for they don't know what they are doing. Right? And then he not only said forgive and then modeled it, but then other people did that as well. Stephen, when he was being martyred, he said almost the exact same thing. He said, don't hold this sin against them. Which is, just mind-boggling. And I even wonder how much that prayer affected Saul. Like, how much did Stephen's, in that moment, saying, don't hold this against them, how much God responded to that prayer when he reached Saul. This is revolutionary. Love forgives. And Jesus said that forgiveness is even a part of having received forgiveness, that we need to be the type of people who forgive because we've been forgiven. And so for us, we need to do the radical thing of forgiving. God calls us to that level of forgiving. I know somebody who literally kept a notebook all the times this person was wronged. Wrote it down for literally decades. Had wrongs in this. And for this person, it was like a point of power for them because they had written it down. The end result was that they felt like they could bring those things up at any time and they could always go back and look at the notebook. That is like the opposite of the movie, The Notebook, right? Like, it's like you keep all the bad stuff that people have done to you over the years and then you can bring it up at the right time. It's an act of power. But it's also limiting for you. More so than anybody else, it's limiting for you. That is not bringing the wholeness that God wants for us in our lives, right? But sometimes then we can take the opposite of that and we can say, hey, because I know somebody who's done this too. I know someone who made a decision, and this decision impacted many people. And when they made this decision that harmed multiple people, they asked for forgiveness from God, and God forgave them. And it's awesome. But then they said, well, God's forgiven me, and if you're going to hold it against me, that's really a you problem. Except they never sought the forgiveness of people. They never said, hey, when I do something that impacts a person, I need to go to that person and seek forgiveness there. They just said, God's forgiven me, so I'm not going back and dealing with that. But they never sought forgiveness from the person or sought reconciliation. Now, it is still possible. You do not need somebody to come to you and seek your forgiveness for you to offer it. But there is a difference between forgiveness and reconciliation. Sin can be forgiven by God, and you will still go to prison. There are consequences for every decision that we make. And I know people who've been forgiven and still went to prison. There were and are and need to be consequences for every decision we make. And some of those consequences are in relationships. So when somebody does something that sins against God and they seek forgiveness from God, I am so thankful for that. And maybe you've even forgiven them, but maybe you don't trust them to the same level that you did before. Right? I mean, Jesus, even when it says in John chapter 2, verse 24, but Jesus didn't trust them because he knew all about people. No one needed to tell him about human nature, for he knew what was in each person's heart. You can forgive someone without entrusting yourself to them. If you know what's going to happen to you, you don't have to give them all access to you. They don't get the all access pass anymore. That all access pass is a privilege, not a right. Okay, so you can, if in that moment, say, hey, all right, I forgive you, I have forgiven you, but you don't get that spot anymore, okay? And that reconciliation is different than forgiveness. Forgiveness can happen with one person. Reconciliation requires two. You cannot have, reconciliation is a two-way street, and unless both people do their part, you can't have it. Forgiveness, though, can happen with one. If you have one-way street, you can offer forgiveness. Reconciliation requires two, okay? So I'm just saying that when somebody says to you, hey, well, you need to just forget that. Well, how come you can't forget that? That's in the past. Well, wait a second. Let's talk about the consequences of that. And there are consequences, okay? So it's possible to forgive without allowing all the access, okay? So as we wrap up today, we're going to talk about one last person. This is the last one. His name is Gus. Let me introduce you to Gus. I think I'm safe on Gus, too. Do we have any Gus's in the house? I heard it, yeah? I'm sorry, Gus. Forgive me. This is Gus. Let's flip over to John chapter 12 to talk about Gus. John chapter 12, Gus. Let me set this up this way. In 1940, there was a Thriller, a movie that came out in the United States. First, it came out in England, and then it was released in 1940 in the U.S. It didn't do great. I mean, it was right in the middle of World War II, and so not a lot of people were going to the movies. but it was very critically acclaimed. The critics went nuts. They responded enthusiastically. So nobody saw the movie, but everybody responded, or the people who know good movies responded enthusiastically to it. So what MGM did is they said, you know what, we're going to buy this movie and remake it. So they bought the rights to remake the movie. But they didn't want anybody to be able to compare it to the previous movie. So they wrote into the contract a clause that said that all existing prints would be destroyed. Okay, even to the point where they searched out all the negatives and tried to destroy all of them. They missed one. So this movie is still available. So in 1940, this movie, it was about this. It was called Angel Street. It was about this person. It started with, the beginning was about this famous opera singer named Alice Alquist. And the very first scene is her getting murdered. Okay, so it's a thriller. All right, so it's not like a warm and fuzzy type movie. She gets murdered by a guy. You never see the guy, but he murders her in order to get her jewels, like her jewelry, because she's famous, she's rich, and so he's trying to get a hold of her jewelry, okay? But as this person is searching for the jewelry, Alice's niece walks in and scares him off. Never see him, but he gets scared away, never finds the jewels. Paula finds her aunt murdered. It's devastating. She moves to Italy, and she goes to school there. Okay, so that's the gist of the movie. She meets this older guy, distinguished gentleman, falls in love, whirlwind romance. They move back then and move into that house. As soon as they move into the house, weird things start happening. Paula is her name, the niece, and she starts noticing things weird, like things go missing around the house. And the older distinguished gentleman, Greg, says, I don't know what's going on. This is something that you're imagining. And then he says, I think you're actually doing these things. So I have a clip from the destroyed negative, or the one negative that was still, it's in the public domain now. And this clip is, well, you can find it on YouTube. So here's Angel Street, a clip from Angel Street.
What is it?
I've just noticed something. If you put it right when I'm not looking, I will say no more about it.
What's the matter? I don't understand. Paul, don't turn your back on me.
Look on the wall behind you.
Picture, it's gone again.
Yes. Where have you hidden it this time?
I didn't take it. Why should I take it? It's no use to me.
Why should you take other things? Pencils, knives.
Paul, don't.
Bella, where's the picture?
Bella, where's the picture? They knew how to make movies then, like the music, you know something intense is happening, right? And there's a picture not on the wall. It's like, but that's intense, and you know it's intense. We made up most of the words. We couldn't really understand what they were saying. So the closed captions, if you're like, man, are you sure that's what they're saying? No, we have no idea. I think this is kind of what they're trying to say. But so she starts seeing things and hearing things. She hears sounds in the attic. And then Greg, his name is Greg, it's actually Gregory or something. He assures her that they're not actually there. Then she starts noticing something's happening with the lights, that they're dimming, but that isn't true either, according to Greg. And then things start going missing. The painting disappears off the wall, and the pencils and the knives are misplaced. And he starts telling her, hey, I think you're doing these things. Finally, she meets someone who tells her she's not hallucinating. And she finds out that Greg is actually Alice's killer, and that he had been searching for the jewels all along. The sounds from the attic were actually him searching, the lights dimming. What he was doing while he was up there is he was messing with the pipes, right? He was decreasing the gas and hiding pictures and pencils and knives in order to convince her that she was actually insane, so that she will be committed and he can find the jewels and get away. Angel Street, when it was re-released because MGM bought the rights. They had Ingrid Bergman in the movie, and it was so critically acclaimed when it was re-released in 1944 after the war that it ended up winning multiple Oscars, was a massive release, made lots of money. But when they re-released it, they decided to give it not the name that it got in the U.S. when it was first released, but the name that it had in England when it was released, Gaslight. It was called Gaslight, after what Greg would do in the attic when he would adjust the lighting in order to convince her that she could not trust her own thoughts. If the word toxic gets thrown around a lot, gaslighting is thrown around even more. Webster's dictionary last year actually named gaslighting the word of the year for 2022. Its usage increased 1,720% from the year before. It just beat out last year, oligarch. So gaslighting was the word of the year in 2022. That means something. But gaslighting means something. Gaslighting means when someone is trying to isolate and manipulate you to be totally reliant upon them and convince you that you cannot trust your own thoughts. So this is Gus, but he's not just Gus. He is Gus Leiter. See what we did there? You're Gus Leiter, okay. Gaslighters try to convince you that you can't trust your own thoughts. So for today's message, when he drives you crazy, literally. When he drives you crazy. We're in John chapter 12 today because we're going to read about one of the most toxic people in Scripture. But not just him, a situation. This is the story of Judas. And Judas is a tragic figure, right? But even as you think about the consequences for your actions, Judas and his decisions had consequences. And even as you look at that, I don't want to make him out to be any worse than he is, but he betrayed the Son of God, and there were consequences for that. The story we're going to read today, though, is apparently, because this story is recorded in John, it's also recorded in Matthew and Mark. Matthew and Mark actually say this story, what happens today, what we are reading right now, is the thing that causes Judas to go and betray Jesus. That right after this, he heads off and he comes to the initial agreement with the religious leaders to turn Jesus in when he has an opportunity. So then, after the meal of Passover, he has the opportunity. He goes and gets them and brings them back. But this is the thing that pushes him over the edge, and so as a result, he ends up starting looking for the opportunity to betray Jesus. But chapter 12 is the pivot point in John as well. The last 11 chapters are the first half of the book, essentially. And in that you find what are called signs. I've talked about this before. But chapter 12 is the pivot when it talks about the last week of Jesus' life. So John chapter 11, or 1 through 11, are Jesus' ministry. And then chapter 12 zeroes in and talks about, for the rest of the book, 1 week, or just about 1 week for most of it. And the beginning of that, the thesis statement, I guess you could say, is this first story. This is the story John decides to tell first. So we're going to read just starting in verse 1. John chapter 12, verse 1. 6 days before the Passover, Jesus came to Bethany, where Lazarus was, whom Jesus had raised from the dead. So the story right before this is that. It's Jesus raising Lazarus from the dead. So this is right after that. And yet John, when he tells this story, starts with the fact, in case you forgot in the last chapter, Lazarus is the one that Jesus raised from the dead. Well, that doesn't make a ton of sense unless John really wants you to get that what happens here is very much tied to what happens there. That what happens in this story pours out of what happens in that story, okay? And so that seems to be the case. And so Lazarus was at Bethany, whom Jesus had raised from the dead. So they gave a dinner for him, it seems to be Jesus, in his honor there. Martha served, and Lazarus was one of those reclining with him at the table. So here's a dinner to honor Jesus. Martha is doing what Martha does. She is serving. This is not the time when Jesus rebukes her for serving with a wrong attitude or with the wrong heart behind it. And so apparently she's either worked that out or something, or she's just keeping her mouth shut. We don't know. But she hasn't stopped serving. So if anything, she's probably stopped serving with the wrong heart. Now she's serving perhaps with gratitude in her heart, right? So as an act of gratitude, as an act of honoring Jesus, now she serves in a different manner. Mary, therefore, took a pound of expensive ointment made from pure nard and anointed the feet of Jesus and wiped his feet with her hair. The house was filled with the fragrance of the perfume. Now, Elizabeth, Kevin, Suzanne, and I are going to do for you a human video. No, I'm just kidding. I'm just joking. You're like, what? Finally, a human video. Some of you are like, what's a human video? If you're under the age of like 20, you're like, human video? Okay, when I first accepted Christ in the early 2000s, we had this thing we did called human videos, okay? And a human video was enacting a drama to a song, typically by CeCe Winans or something, or Ray Boltz or something, and everybody would weep, and it was beautiful. And for whatever reason, I was good at human videos, okay? If you want to know why, like 20% of the people, when I was voted in as pastor, was like, man, that guy can do some human videos. Whew. I was always Jesus. I think it was the hair. And, but this is the story for human videos, right? Like, this is the story that, like, every time I read this story, I just think about the emotion, because it's so rich and it's so beautiful and it's so thick and you can feel it. Now, even like when you think about the smell in the room, like, I don't know about you, how many of you are cologne people? If you're a cologne or a perfume person, raise your hand. Okay, I'm not. I'm not really a cologne or a perfume person, but I used to be, okay? And so this week I decided to go back in the back of my vanity in my bathroom. Like, I found this thing buried underneath it. This is the cologne that I used to wear. Now, this is called Curve. Anybody remember Curve? Okay. Yeah. This was like, how many of you still wear Curve? That's good, because I was looking at, never mind, it's not important. But I haven't worn this stuff in a really long time. But this stuff came out in like 1996 by Liz Claiborne, Curve. Whew. And in the mid-90s, when this came out, all the commercials showed like the guy wearing Curve with like women draped on them. And so it got me because I was a teenager in the 90s. And so I'm like, oh, I'm getting some of that, you know. And so I bought some Curve. And I probably went through 2 full bottles of it in like the first 2 weeks. And then, because man, you know, anyways. But then, and I wore it for a while, right? Like through the 90s into the early 2000s. And I was like, I wonder if I remember that smell. Whew. And so I was like, I wonder what that's like. So I went back in there and I opened it up and as soon, bang, just remembered that smell. This stuff now you can buy, at the time it was like $50 or $60. But now you can buy it for like $20 on Amazon. And when you look at the reviews, or I guess there's perfume review websites, like this started me down a weird dark path, right? As I'm like, I wonder what Curve, is this stuff people still wear? And like the number one reason why people wear Curve, nostalgia. Like from the 90s, what you remember. Anyways, so then from there I'm like, so what are people? And then I was like, what's the most expensive perfumes and colognes in the world today. And I found the top 5 most expensive perfumes in the world today. Number 5, Parfum 6. I don't know. I assume it's French. $89,000 for one little bottle of this stuff. I know. 89 grand. That's number 5, though, so you know it's only going up from there. Okay. Number 4, Majesté Impériale, I think. $215,000 for a little bottle of this stuff. Opera Prima, $235,000. Golden Delicious by DKNY. Get it? DKNY, Big Apple, Golden Delicious. All right, anyways. $1 million for a bottle of this stuff. I mean, come on, really? But it's like the bottle's encrusted with diamonds and sapphires and stuff like that. So it's as much about, that was $1 million worth right there, kind of thing. But the number 1 is Shamouk by Nabil, $1.5 million for a little bottle about this size. Now, as I smelled this is intense because we have laboratories and the processing and the style of how that stuff works now is so much more intense. But even then, the manufacturing process for nard, for example, that would have cost a lot. And then it came from a root that was in India and then processed into this fluid. And then from that, it was caravanned over to Israel where she gets it. So value-wise, we're talking about somewhere between $30,000 and $50,000. And a pound, well, if you wanted to visualize it, this is 16.9 fluid ounces, which weighs just over a pound. So if you're wondering how much did Mary use, that's it right there. Every time you drink a bottle of water, that's what it looked like. And she busted this, and she poured it out on Jesus's feet. Somewhere between 30 and 50. I would have said $30,000, but last 2 years, $50,000, right? Like inflation. Yeah. So at a dinner in Jesus' honor, Martha served, Lazarus lived, and Mary was at Jesus' feet. And every time you find Mary in the Gospels before Jesus' death, she shows up 3 times, and every time, this is where you find her. She either sits at his feet to learn, falls at his feet to mourn, or she anoints his feet as worship. And if you wonder why Mary would have a perfume this expensive, I don't know. But probably it was, you didn't have banks in that day, so it was probably, in some way, it was a savings. It was either her savings account or it was her dowry. We don't really know. But either way, this is in essence who she is. It is her hope and it is her dreams. And she pours it out on Jesus' feet. In Matthew, it actually says that everywhere where the gospel of Jesus is preached, this story will be told, which means that right now, in this very moment, we are fulfilling prophecy. That's cool, huh? That's why we read this story. So she pours it on his feet, and she wipes those feet with her hair. And then there's Judas. But Judas Iscariot, one of his disciples, he who was about to betray him, said, "Why was this ointment not sold for 300 denarii and given to the poor?" So Judas questions her motivations. He questions her decision-making. He questions her worship. He questions her gratitude. And by all accounts, in a vacuum, these questions make sense, right? Like, in a vacuum, this seems totally valid as an argument. Shouldn't Mary care about the poor? Isn't this a colossal waste? $50,000 gone just like that. Maybe Mary was in the wrong. Maybe she started questioning herself. We don't know. But maybe she shouldn't have wasted it. But then you see, he said this, verse 6, not because he cared about the poor, but because he was a thief. And having charge of the money bag, he used to help himself to what was put into it. So she enacts it and pours this out on his feet. So at this point, we assume it's empty. She has dried it with her hair. And at that point, Judas questions her motivations. He's not getting that money back. And he is motivated not truly by seeking to help the poor. He is motivated by the fact that now he's just mad. And so the way he's going to display that is by making her question her own motivations and her love. He has manufactured a purpose in order to question her. And it works, at least on the disciples. We know, according to Matthew and Mark, it says there that not only did Judas think this, that the other disciples too joined in and they're like, yeah, how come? That this argument worked. And again, in a vacuum, it would make sense. But now we know first what Judas's motivations are in questioning. But second, you already know what Mary's motivations are in doing it, right? Lazarus sits right there. How much is that worth? Her brother is alive and he was dead. You want to know why she does what she does here? He's right there. And more, sitting right there is the creator of the universe. How can you put a limit on the gratitude that he deserves? So here is someone in this moment who knows gratitude. She knows generosity. She knows love. And Judas is seeking to undermine those things. He insists that this is selfish and prideful. And so Jesus responds. And here's what Jesus says. Jesus said, "Leave her alone, so that she may keep it for the day of my burial. For the poor you always have with you, but you do not always have me." Jesus says Mary doesn't even fully realize the purpose of this. And through the end of John, you see that even Nicodemus and Joseph, when they went to bring Jesus, it says that they were limited on time, and so they packed in with him the things that they intended to anoint him with. And so then they were going to come back on Sunday and actually do that. But by then he had already raised from the dead. So by all accounts, this is the only anointing Jesus receives in his death and burial. And Mary's act of gratitude is so much more than she even realizes. So Jesus says, leave her alone. The poor you will always have with her. Okay. When Jesus says that, he is quoting from two passages in Deuteronomy. And I want to read those to you real quick because I want you to understand what Jesus is saying here, essentially what he's pointing out. Okay, Deuteronomy chapter 15, verse 11. Here's the first passage he is quoting from. And the other one's also right next to it. So one comes out of the other one. So verse 11, he says, "For there will never cease to be poor in the land. Therefore I command you, you shall open wide your hand to your brother, to the needy, and to the poor in your land." So Jesus is saying, from that, when he quotes that, he's actually pulling this verse out. Now, you and I, when we first read that, we don't know that it's quoting from Deuteronomy chapter 15, but I guarantee you they did. But here's what's really interesting. Here's what's really interesting. I've not heard anybody else say this. I'm just saying that this is interesting to me. This is not the first time in this passage where something like that is said. If you back up just a few verses, back to verse 4, here's actually where it comes from. Verse 4, "But there will be no poor among you, for the Lord will bless you in the land that the Lord your God is giving you for an inheritance to possess." Wait, what? Are there going to be poor in the land, or are there not going to be poor in the land? Because he says there will always be poor in the land. But he just promised right before that, hey, there's not going to be any poor among you in the land that I'm giving you as an inheritance. He makes an incredible promise here. But then read the next verse. He says, "There will be no poor among you, for the Lord will bless you in the land that the Lord your God is giving you as an inheritance to possess, if only you will strictly obey the voice of the Lord your God, being careful to do all this commandment that I command you today." He says, there will be no poor among you if you obey my commands. But you're not going to obey my commands, so there will always be poor among you in the land. As a result, you ought to be generous. That seems to be the argument of Deuteronomy chapter 15, and Jesus brings that verse up for Judas. This is a judgment that Jesus is quoting. There will always be poor among you. You ought to be generous because you will not follow those commands. Jesus is pointing out in this instance Judas's own failings to fulfill the commandments. He is very much touching on the fact that Judas is not as righteous in this moment as he is pretending to be. In fact, we do know that right after this, that Judas's own response to Jesus saying this is that he goes and seeks to betray him, right? So this is enough of a rebuke. This is enough of a judgment. This is enough of a thing that it makes Judas go after Jesus. So when Jesus quotes this, he is quoting as a judgment against Judas and his own motivations. Jesus is putting him in his place. All right, so let's talk about gaslighters. Because I think you see, Judas very much, because at first, again, you read this and you think, man, that's so good, until you realize that in reality, Judas is not serious about actually helping, right? Instead, all he's doing is trying to undermine her own confidence in this moment. Like, he is trying to attack that. Maybe even Jesus himself, we don't know. But gaslighters try to do 4 things, okay? 4 things. Here's the 4 things that gaslighters do. And this is standard. This is a real psychological issue, by the way. This is considered by just about everybody to be psychological abuse. Number 1, gaslighters seek to invalidate your feelings. They seek to devalue your worth. They seek to deny the truth. And they seek to blame you for the effects of their decisions. That is established what gaslighting is. They invalidate your feelings, devalue your worth, deny the truth, and blame you for the effects of their decisions. Here's some of the things that gaslighters say. That didn't happen. You're imagining things. You're so dramatic. You're making things up. So those are the things that gaslighters say. That didn't happen. You're imagining things. You're so dramatic. You're making things up. And they are seeking to invalidate your feelings, devalue your worth, deny the truth, and blame you for the effects of their own decisions. So how do you do battle when someone is literally trying to drive you crazy? First, think on the argument, not in the argument. And this is what Jesus does here. He sees through Judas's arguments, and you can see Jesus responding to the underlying issue. Okay? And Judas's response is actually typical narcissistic response to somebody calling them out on this sort of thing. They do something drastic. That's typically what happens when there's somebody who's a narcissist. Narcissists are known to gaslight. But here's the thing. Don't get dragged into the weeds, right? Don't get dragged into the weeds of the argument, the little details of the argument. That is the playground of a gaslighter. If you get dragged into the details of the argument, so don't go to the details of the argument. Think instead on why the argument is happening. Think about your own thinking. Think about their thinking. You do not have to prove anything to that person. You don't have to convince them that they are wrong and you are right. They aren't anchored in truth, right? That's why this argument is so effective with Judas. He has no qualms about rebuking Mary and maybe even Jesus in reality, knowing that he is stealing, right? So he has no qualms in that moment because he's not anchored in the truth. So if you had just argued with him on the basis of that, well, but wait a second, here's the thing. If you had argued with him in that moment, he would just shift to a totally other unanchored argument. It doesn't have to be anchored in truth. There's nothing that is holding them to that. So you will never out-argue them. They'll just move to a totally different, unanchored argument. That is their playground. So don't get deeply in the weeds in an argument with somebody who gaslights you, okay? Instead, talk to someone you trust about the situation. Gaslighters like to isolate you. They seek to cut you off from others who might see something that you won't. And isolation is a powerful tool Proverbs chapter 18, verse 1 says, "Whoever isolates himself seeks his own desire. He breaks out against all sound judgment." It may make sense to no one else, and you end up doing something like that because you got sucked into isolation. So talk to somebody you trust. Talk to a Christian counselor and explain what's going on. And if you don't know one, get in touch with us and we will get you connected with one. Somebody that you can talk to say, hey, here's some of the stuff that I'm dealing with. Can you kind of talk me through, hey, am I crazy? Because that's the thing. You start to question, am I crazy? Is this a me thing? Did I move the picture? Is this me? Am I the one? And just ask some serious questions, but get somebody else involved that you trust, okay? And then, if you are being gaslit, disengage, set boundaries, and step away. Gaslighting is psychological abuse. It is recognized on every level as psychological abuse. It is dangerous and it is unhealthy. And so it is okay for you, when you are in a conversation with someone who is doing that to you, to say, I feel like you are distorting reality. It is unsettling me, and I will talk to you later when I have calmed down. Just say it. And it is okay to set boundaries on your statement saying, you cannot say things like, that didn't happen, you're imagining things, you're so dramatic, you're making things up. You can say, don't say that to me. Don't tell me I'm too sensitive. It is okay for you to say, don't question my reality. It is okay for you to say, I feel like you are gaslighting me. Period. And it is not your job to stop the abuser from abusing. It is not your job to stop the gaslighter from gaslighting. It is your job to keep yourself from being gaslit. That is boundaries. It is never your job to stop the abuser from abusing. It is to stop yourself from being abused. Okay? In some ways, man, I'm so glad to leave this series behind. It has been difficult, and I don't like labeling people. I don't like talking about toxicity in people. I don't like setting boundaries. I don't like telling people that there are times to walk away. I don't. I do want to be nice. But man, this one in particular, I wanted to end with, because you find it just everywhere. The reason why this word has increased so much in usage from one year to the next is because, boy, it's happening every day to you, whether you know it or not. All of these toxic traits are tactics that the enemy uses against you daily, right? Gaslighting, anger, rage, gossip, envy, criticism, trolling. These are his tactics. And being aware of them in others help us to see where he has gotten a hold of their lives. But even as we wrap this series up, I think it's important to end here also because, as I've read this story, I was struck by, I think it's remarkable that Jesus embraces Judas and rebukes Peter. Right? Like, the person you expect him to rebuke, he embraces even as he comes to betray him. Do you betray me? And he knows what's coming. Do you betray me with a kiss? Right? Like, he knows what's coming and he embraces him anyways. And then Peter, he rebukes, get behind me. Right? Like, the one who delivers him to the cross, he embraces. And the one who tries to keep him from it, he rebukes. And I guess what's so important to recognize is that our struggle is not against flesh and blood. And these are cosmic struggles that are happening every single day, all around us, in us. Gaslighting in particular is happening to you regularly, right? The enemy is doing this to you daily, getting you to question those things you know to be true, right? Getting you to question those things that you have experienced. And then, when you question them, attacking you for questioning them. Like, isn't this just like the tactics of the enemy? But more than that, like, it's happening on the daily basis in the world around us, right? Like, you stop and you look around, you're like, wait, Did the lights just dim? Because this seems new. Like, when did this happen, right? And then when you question it, who are you to question reality? Wait a second. A few years ago, we talked about this totally differently. Oh, wait, I'm not allowed to ask that now. Okay. Gaslighting is happening to you on a daily basis. The lights are changing, and then you're attacked for noticing it. Like, the enemy is doing this. The flesh inside of you is doing this, and the world as a whole is doing this to you daily. This is the battle for our souls that is happening daily. And that's why what we do here is so vitally important, right? Because what we are doing in this place when we worship God, what we are doing when we sit under the Word of God, what we are doing when we take communion is we are bringing back to those things that we know to be true, so that when we step outside and the lights go a little bit dimmer, we go, ha, 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 I know what's happening here. I know you're the one who moved the picture. You can try, but I know what's actually going on. Because you are founded in reality, and the things that are true are always true. Truth does not change. And so you don't have to question, well, wait a second, is this a me thing? Am I the one who's in the wrong here? No, people are nuts, okay? And you just need to know, it's okay, I see it, I know what's going on, I see the lights dimming, I know what's happening. That's the world, it's gonna happen, I shouldn't be surprised, this is what's going to happen. But you and I, man, we know, these things have not changed. And so that's why we worship. Because when we worship, like Mary, the reason why I busted this out this week was because I wanted to know. Nostalgia was number one. And that was the point at which I'm like, I want to know what happens when I smell it. And I didn't even have to pull the bottle out and spray it. As soon as I opened it up, got a whiff of that. Like, it took me back to like the summer of '97. Pearl Jam, the Wallflowers, Foo Fighters, Dave Matthews Band. I'm not saying, this was before I was a Christian, okay? So, like, just know. It took me back to the summer. The caddying. Like, legitimately, I remember prom '98. I remember Liz and my first date, because I was still wearing this in the early 2000s, at Country Kitchen right up the road. Like, as soon as I smell it, and smell more than any other sense is linked to your memory. So when Mary pours this nard on Jesus' feet, and it fills, it says, the entire house. And then she dries those feet with her hair. It's not just in the house, it's in her hair. And from then on, she smelled nard. And I guarantee you, every time she smelled that same perfume for the rest of her life, she was transported back to that moment and that worship of Jesus Christ at his feet. No matter how much someone might seek to undermine you, those things that you have worshiped him in the midst of, you never lose. And no one can take it away from you. And that she's not the only one to do this. It actually says in if you're gonna applaud, like, wait for this, because this is the best part. Because it actually says she's not the only one to do this. It also says a prostitute did this. And the same smell, that perfume, that she used to use to attract men, and her memories would be locked in on that smell and that experience, she poured out on Jesus' feet. And there she's weeping over him and drying her with her hair. And that smell would have been replaced in her memory by that worship. And the very thing that used to be attached to her sin now would remind her of her worship. This is why it is so important what we do in this place. That's why it's so important when we get together to worship, when we get together to sit under the Word of God, when we get together and take communion together. Because every time we do this, we are reminding ourselves of those deep truths that are true, and no matter what anybody else tells you, remain true. And when the lights dim, you go, I see that. I know. I'm not dumb. You can't convince me otherwise. I know what's happening here. And you know Satan and his tactics against you, and you can see them for what they are. That's why worship is so important.